It's part 2 of the Orla Dress sew-along, so stay tuned! It's part 2 of the Orla Dress sew-along, and in this part we are going to make the entire bodice top. So we're going to put in our darts, set in our gathered sleeves, and we're also going to finish the neckband. Now in this sew-along I am doing a different neckband than the one that is in the pattern instructions. In the pattern instructions they have you cut your own bias strip out of your fashion fabric. But I just found that it was quicker and easier to get some bias tape that matched the fabric, so I didn't have to make my own bias strip. To see more episodes like this, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to get notified of new videos. So I have used a 1/2 inch single fold bias tape to finish out my neckline. So with your supplies at hand, your pattern pieces all cut out and ready to go, let's get started on making the bodice top to our Orla dress. Now it's time to finally get to sewing our Orla dress. And so I have got my bodice pieces. So we're going to start with the bodice pieces as the directions state. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is to sew the darts. So if I take my back pieces here, for example, I'm going to pin my darts together. So I'm going to make sure I have my piece, and I'm going to take that line, and most often than not on a dart you'll have this little triangular piece that pokes out of the edge of the bodice. So you're going to fold along that triangular piece because that is going to be the center of the dart. And you're going to take a pin through the line and make sure that you've gotten through the line on the other side. Make sure that those lines line up. And if they don't, you can kind of fiddle with the fabric and the pin until they are lined up. See, that's lined up now. So I've got my first one pinned and ready, and I'm going to go ahead and pin all the darts for the front and the back. So I have my front bodice piece pinned down with its darts and the two back bodice pieces also pinned down. Now I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine you're going to want to start your dart at the raw edge, so from the edge, the bottom edge of the bodice, and we're going to stitch along that dart line at a 2.5 inch stitch length using a straight stitch. And you're going to start by just back tacking that dart in just to make sure that it is in place. And again, you're going to follow that line of the dart. So as you come up to the point of the dart, you're going to start coming in a little bit, and then you're going to go to the smallest stitch length. So I'm going to go up to close to a 0 and stitch, and I'm going to stitch all the way off the fabric. Once I have that, you can see that I have my tiny narrow stitch lengths at the end. I'm going to go ahead and trim off my thread pieces at both ends of the dart. And I'm going to take just a little bit of fray check and place it at the very tip of that dart. Now the tiny stitching is going to lock it in place, and keep that dart from unraveling without doing a knot, which is a typical method of finishing off your dart. Adding a knot could make it a little pointier than it should be and add a little bit extra bulk. So just using a smaller stitch length can actually make it set a little bit better. Now, when you go to make your next dart, you need to remember that you've actually set your stitch length all the way down to the half. So you need to move it back to the 2.5 and then just repeat the process. We now have our darts fully sewn up, and we're going to now take these to the iron. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a pressing ham, and at the iron we're going to take the ham so that the point is at the top, and using an iron we are actually going to press our seams toward the center front and toward the center back. As you can see here, we have our darts nicely pressed in towards the center seams, and what we want to do now is we want to pin the shoulder seams of the bodice front to the bodice back. So to do this, I'm going to set my bodice front wrong side facing down, right side facing up, and we're going to pin these right sides together. So I'm going to take one of my bodice backs, so the right side of the bodice back facing the right side of the bodice front. We actually marked it on the wrong side of the fabric with a W so that we knew which side was the wrong side, but now that our darts are sewn into place, we can quickly identify which one's the wrong side. So I'm just going to line up the shoulder seams here, and I'm going to do the same thing for the other bodice back piece. So I'm going to take this bodice back piece, and using my pins I'm going to go ahead and match up my shoulder seams here. Now we're going to take this back to the sewing machine and sew our seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. We're going to be using a standard straight stitch with a 2.5 inch stitch length. We have sewn our shoulder seams, and remember, when sewing your seams you're going to be doing a back stitch at the start and end of each seam. Now before we move on, we want to finish these seams, and you can do this a number of ways. We could take this over to our serger / overlocker and finish it that way. We could also do a very narrow zigzag stitch along the edge, but one of my quick and easy methods of finishing a seam, and especially for something like this that's a lightweight cotton, I like to use my pinking shears. So basically I'm just going to take my seam here and I'm going to cut right down the middle of it, of the seam allowance, using my pinking shears, just like so. And I'm going to do that to the other side here. And that helps keep our seams from fraying and just finishes it off a little bit nicer. Now that we finished off our shoulder seams with the pinking shears, we're going to take this back to the iron and press this seam towards the back of the bodice. So here is our bodice. The shoulder seams have been sewn, finished, and pressed towards the back of the bodice. Now to start on the neckband. Now the pattern calls for you to make your own bias strip for creating the neckband, but I have opted to use a 1/2 inch single fold bias tape. As you can see, mine is almost the exact same color as my fabric, so it's going to work wonderfully. And what we're going to do, actually, I'm going to turn this around so that the right side of the bodice is facing up. The first thing that we're going to want to do is you're going to identify which side is the larger side of the fold. Not that it really matters a whole lot, but I'm just going to say that this bottom piece here is the larger side. So this is the narrower side. We're going to unfold the narrower side of the bias tape, and we're basically just going to pin the raw edge of that bias tape up to the raw edge of our neckline with the right sides again facing. And when making a neckband like this, cutting fabric on the bias or using bias tape will give it just a little bit extra stretch to the fabric, which helps when coming around the curves here. As you can see, I have pinned my bias tape all around my neckline. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So along the fold of that bias tape that we've opened up, I'm going to stitch along that line all the way around. And now that we're at the sewing machine, we're going to stitch in the ditch along that fold crease of the bias tape. And we're going to do that using a straight stitch and a 2.5 inch stitch length. Again, you're going to want to back stitch. So here you can see that we've stitched down our bias tape all the way around the neckline. So the next step is to take your bias tape and take the fold, just like the whole thing is folded down. Now we're going to take it along that seam and we're going to go ahead and we're going to fold it over along this seam here. So here you can see we've got our neckband all pinned down, and if we fold it over you can see that it is the folded bias tape, so all the raw edges are encased. Now our bias tape is 1/2 inch in width, so we're going to go ahead and sew a top stitching 1/2 inch away from the edge of the neck line. Now we've got our neckband sewn up just like so. The next thing we want to do is make sure that our right sides of the bodice pieces are facing, and we're going to go ahead, pin and sew up our side seams for our bodice. Here is our bodice piece so far, and we're looking at the wrong side of the fabric here. So we've got our darts made, we added our shoulder seam, so the front and back pieces are together. We added our neck binding, and then we also went ahead and stitched up our side seams and pinked those seams as well, and then ironed everything towards the center back. And move on to adding the sleeves. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create some gather stitches from the yellow dots here, our circles. And we're going to go ahead and create 2 lines of gathering stitches. To create our gather stitches, we're going to go ahead and change our stitch lengths to the largest stitch lengths available, and mine is 4 inches. And I'm going to start sewing with my presser foot on the edge of the fabric, and I'm going to start at that first dot that I made. And I'm not going to back stitch. I'm going to hold some of the thread out, and I'm going to just stitch around that raw edge there. I've come down to the other yellow dot. I'm going to lift my needle and I'm going to pull out some excess thread. I'm going to snip that off. And now I'm going to do another set of gathered stitches, this time at my seam allowance. So at the 3/8 inch. Again, I want to make sure that I have some threads pulled out, no back stitching, and we're just going to make another line of stitching here. You're going to repeat the process for the other sleeve. And there are your gathered stitches. Now before we do anything with these gathered stitches, we're going to go ahead and sew the side seams of our sleeve here. Now this time, since we're sewing our side seam, we need to make sure that we change our stitch length back to the 2.5 inch stitch. And we're sewing at the 3/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to also want to back stitch at the start and finish. Here we have our sleeve pieces prepped. We've got our 2 rows of gathered stitches. We also sewn the side seam and finished them off with pinking shears. The next thing that we're going to do is actually get these sleeves into our bodice. So I'm going to set the sleeves aside, return back to our bodice pieces, which right now are wrong sides facing out. And you can see that I have the front bodice piece and here's the back bodice piece. Now, there is a notch on the front bodice piece at the underarm that matches up with a notch on the sleeve. So before we get started, what you have to do is make sure that your bodice is facing wrong side out, and you're going to take your sleeve pieces and turn those wrong side in so that the right side of the fabric is facing out. And then from there, I'm going to find the matching notch. So this is the right side, there's my notch. This is the wrong side, here's my sleeve hole, and there's the notch. And the right sides of the fabric, so the sleeve that has the right side is going to be touching the right sides of the bodice. So to do that, we're going to put the sleeve inside the hole, and now the right side of the bodice and the right side of the sleeve are going to be touching, and we're going to line up that notch there for the front and sleeve. Moving along, we're going to match up the side seams. So the last place that we have to match up is the center top of the sleeve, which we have a little notch there, and that gets matched up with the top shoulder seam. Alright, so our main points have been matched up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our gathering stitches and we're going to separate them so that there are 2 on either side, the 2 rows. And on one of the sides, we'll say the inside here, we're going to go ahead and tie the top and bottom stitching together. So just like this. And this will prevent our gathered stitching from falling out. We'll do it on the other side as well. So we're going to separate the 2 sides, and on the inside we'll go ahead and tie these 2 inside threads together. Take the 2 other thread pieces that are on the front, and we're going to slowly and gently pull. And as we pull, we're going to push the fabric forward. All the way up to that center point. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. So now we have a very tightly packed sleeve. So we're gently going to loosen up those gathers so that they fit the circumference of the sleeve. And then we're going to do the same thing for the other side. The thing you're going to need to do is adjust your sewing machine for a sleeve insertion. So my sewing machine has this top plate that comes off. So I can take that off, and now I can put my sleeve hole around the base here. Now I can just take my sleeve hole like this and bring it onto the sewing machine, and I'm going to line it up so that I have the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch. And I'm not going to back stitch this time because we're going to go around the whole circumference, and as we come back around we'll just kind of go over our stitching. Again, we're using a 2.5 inch stitch length using a straight stitch. And now we have our sleeve attached. We're going to flip the bodice to the front to check to see how well we did. Now you will have on the front side, you might find that you have your gathered stitches, the ends of those still hanging out, so you can snip those off. And if you find that any of your gather stitches, maybe they were off a little bit, are past your seam allowance, you can really easily take care of that by taking a seam ripper and simply getting rid of those gathered stitches. We now have our sleeves attached to our bodice pieces, just like so, and I've gone ahead and pinked the seam allowance along the sleeve on the inside, and I've done that for both sleeves. So the next step we need to do in order to finish these sleeves off completely is to actually sew the hem on the end of the sleeve. Now, according to the pattern, we have a 2 centimeter seam allowance, which is approximately 3/4 an inch. So I'm going to take my ruler here, and I am working on the right side of the fabric. So this is the right side of the fabric. I'm going to set my sleeve kind of flat here, and I'm going to mark the 3/4 measurement, and I'm just going to kind of do sort of a dashed line here. I just need a reference for when we go to the iron here momentarily. So I'm going to do the same thing on the back. Alright, so I've got my markings, and what I want to do is I want to take the sleeve to the iron, and I want to fold and press along that hemline. I've pressed our hem of our sleeve down. And what we're going to do now is go to the inside, or the wrong side of the fabric, inside the bodice, and we're going to open up that pressing hem that we just did, and we're going to take the raw edge, fold it over to the folded press line, fold it over a second time to enclose that raw edge along the hem, and then press it back down along the hemline. And we press it so that you get this nice encased fold. Now, because it's pressed, it should hold in place, so we won't need to pin it. I'm just going to pull my sleeve back out towards the right side. What I'm going to do now is that you could do this a couple of different ways. You could do a blind hem stitch on your sewing machine, or you could do a hand sewn catch stitch to do a nice clean and invisible stitch down of your hem. But since we already have the lovely top stitching around the collar, I'm just going to play that through. So I'm just going to take this to the sewing machine and top stitch all the way around the hem of the sleeve. So here's where we are so far. We have the bodice completed, and you can see I've got it here on the dress form, and I've just got her sort of pinned in right now just to hold her in place. But I've got the darts on both the front and the back, everything sewn together. We've got this lovely top stitching along the neck collar, and then the top stitching around the sleeve hem as well. So now all we have left to do is the skirt, and then we can finish it up with a zip.
Now we're going to take this back to the sewing machine. What the heck? Okay. You know what? I didn't record any of that. Dang it. What? There we go. Ow. Okay, let's do that.